Hi, today we're going to go over a high-level explanation of how this infinite bedrock breaking setup works. The goal of this video is less to explain how you would specifically use this machine, and more how you would understand the mechanics behind it. If you already have a good understanding, you probably don't need to watch this, and I won't be offended if you click away. However, because things change very frequently and machines are improved upon and people come up with different concepts, I thought it would be valuable to have an explanation that kind of covers all the fundamentals and the different concepts that you might see used in a machine like this. We will use this machine as our example, but you should be able to apply these concepts to any other infinite bedrock breaking setup that uses lazy chunks. If you want, there are timestamps in the description. Feel free to skip ahead. We're going to start out with a brief introduction to piston-based bedrock breaking. A bedrock breaker is an automatic slime block-based falling machine that, in the course of its movement, destroys bedrock blocks. Due to the underlying mechanics of this in recent versions, each time a bedrock is broken, a piston is also destroyed. Therefore, for every bedrock that you want to break with such a machine, a pre-placed piston would also usually be required. In a three-way bedrock breaker, which is a variant that can destroy an area of bedrock, these pre-placed pistons would generally be seen as a massive slab of pistons waiting to be consumed. As each new bedrock broken requires a piston to be destroyed, there is naturally a limit to how long the machine can run. When it runs out of pistons, it will stop working. Running a machine like this is obviously costly. To destroy around 2.5 million bedrock for another perimeter on the Mechanist server, we had to craft and use up a corresponding 2.5 million pistons. The results were fantastic, but the resource collection was a time sink. Previously, if you wanted to get around this, there were really only two ways. Firstly, you could dupe pistons, removing the cost. However, item duplication is generally considered to be cheating, and it's not an interesting solution to the problem regardless. The second approach is more engaging. You could preserve the piston somehow. Early on, some people considered having a player run behind the bedrock breaker, picking up the pistons as they're destroyed. But this requires active player intervention, mostly defeating the purpose of having an automatic system in the first place. It doesn't help that larger areas can take days or weeks to run machines over. For an automatic solution, some people investigated having flying machines pick up the pistons as they're dropped. Unfortunately, space and reliability issues made this more trouble than it was worth. With any of these solutions, you wouldn't be able to run the machine forever regardless. Holes in the bedrock, lava pockets, item glitches, or other problems would all lead to losing some pistons, and the machine's supply would inevitably run out. This infinite bedrock breaking setup uses a different approach entirely, as suggested by Sava and developed into a machine by Dezu. Through this approach, we're able to make a machine that can run infinitely, automatically, and it can break bedrock for, theoretically, forever. Alright, so I know what you're thinking. What's a lazy chunk? For the purposes of our explanation, we're going to go with the following definition. A lazy chunk is a chunk where redstone mechanics work, pistons, observers, and so on, but entities don't do anything by themselves. In technical terms, entities don't tick. An example of an entity is an animal, like a sheep, which wouldn't move around in a lazy chunk or eat grass. Another example of an entity is an item, which wouldn't move of its own accord in a lazy chunk. For example, item entities won't fall while they're in a lazy chunk. Crucially, they can still be moved by pistons, because pistons still work properly in a lazy chunk, and they're going to interact properly with items. In lieu of more words, let's observe how this works in practice. This is a 1.17 single-player world. I've marked out a few chunks here with different colors, so we can easily identify which is which, and set my render distance to 7. I've also enabled chunk borders, so we can more clearly see the boundaries. We have a number of droppers here, facing down. Each one has some items in it. I'm going to go ahead and power all the droppers, while standing in the base chunk. Alright, now I'm going to use a tool called Carpet to prevent any further ticks from being processed. That means that we can fly around and observe exactly what the current state of the game is, but everything will stay frozen, just as it was when we were right here. For the first few chunks, we can see that everything is the same. The items were shot out of the droppers and fell to the ground. This is the normal expected behavior. In these chunks, which we could call entity ticking, redstone mechanics like droppers work normally, and entities also tick normally, so the items are free to fall to the ground. Once we get to the sixth chunk, however, things are different. We can see that the items have been ejected from the droppers, but they haven't fallen. This is because this chunk was a lazy chunk. Redstone mechanics still function normally, so each dropper was able to eject an item. But the item itself, as it's an entity, did not tick, so it wasn't able to fall to the ground. It stayed in exactly the same position. As a quick note, these falling items are a visual glitch. As you can see, I can pick them up by flying around up here. Despite where they appear to be, they are frozen the same way as the other items. Finally, the seventh chunk, the last chunk that was loaded, as my render distance was set to 7, has no items whatsoever. That's because this is a border chunk, and although it's visible and technically rendered in, neither entities nor redstone mechanics are going to do anything here. Alright, so let's summarize what we've learned. In single player, the chunks at render distance from the player are border chunks, where neither redstone mechanics nor entities do anything. That means if our flying machine goes into a border chunk, it will stop working. That's not very good. The chunks one closer to the player than render distance are lazy chunks, where redstone mechanics work normally, but entities don't do anything by themselves. Finally, any closer chunks function normally. Redstone mechanics work, but items are also affected by gravity. That's all you really need to know about lazy chunks, but there's one more thing I need to mention. You'll note that I was very specific when talking about this being the case in single player and 1.17.01. In multiplayer, and in 1.17.1, things are slightly different. Lazy chunks are one chunk further away. So in single player at 16 render distance, the lazy chunks will be 15 chunks away, whereas in multiplayer, the lazy chunks will be 16 chunks away. This is very important to account for when sending up the machine. Also, in newer versions of the game, for example 1.18, the simulation distance, which is the entity ticking distance from the player, can be set separately from the render distance. If you're using a machine like this, you have to keep in mind that the simulation distance is more important than the render distance. And if you're going to use a calculator, like the one that I made for this machine, you're going to have to keep that in mind and maybe do the reverse calculation to figure out what the render distance should be for your simulation distance. When the pistons are destroyed in the course of bedrock breaking, they drop as piston item entities. If the bedrock breaker is designed with this in mind, and the piston item entities drop in a lazy chunk, then the bedrock breaker can push those entities along with it. As long as they remain in a lazy chunk, then we can continue moving the entities along. Let's use a mod to show exactly how this works in this bedrock breaker. We'll do this because in order for the machine to work normally, we would need to be far away, so we wouldn't be able to see how it worked. With this mod, we can observe exactly what happens under the assumption that items are always remaining in a lazy chunk. First, I'll turn off entity ticking. Next, we'll launch the machine. As you can see, the piston items are accumulating and being pushed along with the machine. Because they aren't affected by gravity, they won't fall into any holes in the bedrock, they'll just move nicely along with the machine. At the end, they accumulate here. Because they're still in a lazy chunk, well, because they aren't ticking, they don't stack, so be careful. If you do this over too wide of an area, the number of entities will grow quite fast, and may lead to more lag. Try to test large widths, say over 300, on a creative server first. As a quick note, there's a reason we need at least 2 players to run this machine, and in theory, any other lazy chunk-based bedrock breaker. You can see that the pistons down here must be in a lazy chunk at all times, but the chunks around the piston items must be redstone processing, because the position of the items in the chunk is arbitrary, so any chunks beside this one might have the machine working in them. With one player, we can load one strip of lazy chunks and an area of entity ticking chunks, but we can't load chunks on both sides of the lazy chunks, so we end up needing 2 players. Next, we send down a 2-way flying machine. This is a setup I made to extract the pistons while they're in a lazy chunk. Because they're not affected by gravity, we can essentially just scoop them up and extract them from where they're deposited. However, this chunk must remain a lazy chunk while we're waiting for this to happen. Otherwise, the piston entities would fall out of the flying machine. In theory, you could design a grabber that wouldn't have this restriction, but it's just easier to do things this way. In order to understand how we manage which chunks are lazy, let's briefly talk about the roles of the 2 side players and how the machine functionality is controlled. The player on the right here is the simplest. It doesn't really do anything in terms of general functionality. Rather, it ensures that the right side of the machine is loaded, while being kept at the correct distance to ensure it doesn't entity load the items. The left side is slightly more complicated. We can see that the player is currently within this holding chamber. This is an extension to the original bedrock breaker set up by Dezu, which keeps the player just the right distance away from the items, so that they remain in a lazy chunk for the right amount of time to be extracted. To better illustrate this, here's a quick diagram of the chunk offsets and where the players are located at this point in the machine's operation. After a delay, the player is sent back to the holding station. This player's flying machine is responsible for controlling the overall bedrock breaker, so when it returns, this system will begin another cycle. We're just going over this because we're using this machine as our example machine. However, future machines might not have this restriction and may not require delaying the left side player at all. Meanwhile, over here, our previously lazy item entities are now affected by gravity, so they fall out of their containing section into the flying machine we used to extract them. I'll turn back on entity ticking so we can see the effect. From here, the system works as follows. These repeating ice segments move over, one after another, propelling the item entities along the ice path. When they reach the end, they drop onto a player or a carpet bot, who is then able to replace the pistons to restock the buffer area. This repeating segment transfers the placed pistons back to the floor placer, where they refill exactly one full line of pistons. The reason we need to keep the piston placing player this far away from the machine is because if that player got any closer to the machine, it's possible it would load the chunk that the items are in and cause them to fall, and then it would break the machine. Because we consistently get back exactly the right number of pistons that are used per row, the floor placing mechanism is very simple. This does make it more brittle, however. If the player placing pistons receives too many or too few pistons, the setup will quickly break. If the area you're breaking is 64 blocks wide, the player must receive exactly 64 piston items each time this moves over. If the area is 128 wide, the player must receive exactly 128 piston items, and so on. Okay, what are the caveats of this setup? Well, because the machine breaks if we lose even one piston, there isn't a lot of room for error. The chunks containing the pistons must remain lazy for any moment where either A, Bedrock is being broken, so 50% of the time, or B, the piston entities have not been fully extracted. That means that coming too close to the machine will, approximately 50% of the time, immediately break it, unless you know how to recover from such a failure. Similarly, because we need to keep chunks lazy, this machine will simply not work in spawn chunks, and neither will any other setup that uses lazy chunks. Because we need at least 2 players to load the machine, you'll need either carpet bots, which I recommend, or a server where multiple players are able to AFK. It's theoretically possible to design a version of the setup where only 2 players are required, as we talked about earlier, but this one does require 3. Because we use a slabless setup with ancient debris, this design can't work in versions before 1.16. Similar to a couple other restrictions, you could theoretically use water or something like that in the overworld and design an earlier version of this machine, but not really worth it. Because the floor placer may not be synced with the player at all times, with low render distances and very large widths, you may need another player loading the floor placer. So this video was initially also going to cover a tutorial for how to use the machine, and I did write most of the script for that, but I don't really have a lot of time right now, and I technically did make a tutorial video for how to use this machine with glots. So that video is linked in the description if you wanted more just like, here's exactly what you need to do to use the machine sort of thing. I will mention that there is a better version of this setup made by Vitamin C, which might be in the description, not sure. But if you want to use the tooling that I made for this machine, you'll have to use this setup. It's not a huge amount different, so really it's your own choice. If you want to use the easier one with a tutorial video, use this. If you think you understand how it all works and are willing to adjust things yourself, you can probably use Vitamin C's. And if you really want to use the best machine possible, you might want to delay for a little bit and subscribe to Dezu on YouTube. Hopefully the concepts and general approach that I've given in this video should be sufficient to work with future designs, regardless of what you're using, Vitamin C's and Dezu's and so on. I would have loved to get this video out a month or 2 ago, when it would have been more useful, but unfortunately it takes a lot of time and effort to put something like this together, including all the tooling and web resources, a lot more than I really expected. If you appreciated the video and somehow made it this far, I'd really love it if you would leave a comment letting me know what worked or didn't work for you in the video, what bits were good, if there's an improvement you'd like to see, if there's some videos you'd like me to make, whatever. And that's about it, so thanks for watching. Here's where I'd regularly roll credits, but I figured I'd do something different for a change and read them out instead. In no particular order, thanks to Matt for helping me flesh out the direction of the video, Dezu for doing all the hard work and fact-checking, Kazerx for finally getting a better microphone. What? Okay. And also removing one whole observer many times. Yeah, that's more accurate. DH for... Okay, the script says... Okay, this just says DH. Gotta work on that. Thanks, DH. Yeah, thanks DH for looking over the script. That's about it. For real this time. So thanks for watching.